we'll go ahead and get started, and hopefully we'll have some more people jump in. Thank you all for joining us to this talk and this virtual kind of talk. My name is Wendy Wisher, and I am a professor in sculpture intermedia, and I'm here to introduce Dana Hansen, who will be our speaker tonight. Dana is from Northern California and has been in Utah for the last 5 years. He received his BFA at BYU, Idaho in 3-dimensional studies, and he's been pursuing an MFA in sculpture intermedia here at the University of Utah. His current research and practice investigates the conceptual aims of digital sculpture, involving its interactive abilities within virtual and augmented reality, and at the same time, a physical integration through 3D printing. His work strives to bridge classical aesthetics and symbolism with digital processes and elements, while questioning the objectiveness of reality and its malleability through time. In conjunction with his artwork, he has been working at the Eccles Health Sciences building in their VR lab as a 3D modeler, where he designs and models for various educational VR simulations and experiences. As a recipient of the University Teaching Assistantship Grant, he created and taught digital sculpture, a class that covers 2D digital rendering, 3D printing, and virtual reality applications. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Dana Hansen.
All right. Thank you very much for that introduction. So I'll go ahead and share my screen here. That way you guys can see the full presentation. All right, perfect. That comes in clear for everyone. All right, so go ahead and just pin my view here so I don't see all your little boxes. Okay, perfect. I also, just before getting started, wanted to thank the university for continuing through and making progression of education such a priority during this difficult time. And thanks to my faculty who've helped me through this semester, and my committee specifically also allowing me to continue towards graduation and to host my thesis talk and exhibition in such a unique way, especially given the circumstances. Daniel Dennett wrote, "Our mind is made up of multiple channels in which specialist circuits try in parallel pandemoniums to do their various things, creating multiple drafts as they go. What we call reality is merely the final draft. Of course, the very next moment requires a whole new manuscript." I read Proust was a neuroscientist in my first seminar class at my first semester of grad school. And the entire book explores artists whose work began to discover and investigate ideas on how our minds work, and oftentimes in contradiction to science at that time, and definitely prior to neuroscience at the time. And this excerpt comes from the chapter that was dealing with Virginia Woolf's work, and it stuck out to me at the time because it dealt with my current mental space, I guess you could say, and all of the ideas I was considering coming into grad school. Grad school for me coincided with a lot of changes, ending a job. Was a loan broker prior to grad school, very non-artistic. A marriage had ended prior. My 20s were coming to an end, and moving from a different city into a relatively new state. And so these were all very stark upheavals in my reality, and I noticed my view of the world altering at an almost matching rate, and drafts of my reality being thrown out, kind of going to this quote as a new draft took its place. And shortly after actually reading this book, I wrote this on my mirror. If you've ever been in my studio, you know you can kind of see if I turn the camera, but there's 2 mirrors on the back where I write a lot of notes. And this was written up early on, perception of reality versus perception is reality, and presents really in the simplest terms what my thesis consists of, that our individual reality isn't really an objective collective, that perception is really more based on a lot of factors like our biases, our memories, our experiences that are constantly changing the way we look and perceive. And it was something that was just more so than any point in my life was occurring at that time. And so really starting here at this idea, I began to explore in my work just subjective nature of reality and how memories, experiences, and biases will ultimately control what our perceptions are. And this is more often than not outside of our conscious control. And of course, the pieces that I started to work on and the work I was doing didn't really all fall along that pathway congruently. It took a lot of tangent pieces and a lot of investigating to find out what I was trying to say and what I was trying to do with my art, which thankfully I'm not going to show some of those, but I wanted to share several that really led to the current body of work that I'm going to show in my exhibition. So this was in my first semester. This was an installation that I titled Melting the Impenetrable Dimensions. And it was in the sculpture room in the art building that I set this up. It was about 13 feet long, this room. And it was derived from my own experience, actually, in a memory I had as a child of being able to shoot lasers out of my eyes. I, like many kids, was very into comic books, into superheroes. And I had this very naive thought, but a very real thought at that time that, if I closed my eyes long enough and charged them, like eventually I'd be able to shoot lasers out of my eyes. And obviously this is a thought that I don't have anymore. And so it was just this idea of our changing perceptions and our changing memories and ideas and influences that lead us to believe what's impossible and what is not impossible. And this became a pivotal piece in understanding really my interest in reality and what binds we place on it and ourselves based on our perceptions. And this was really the first piece that I began to also use digital sculpture. The boy's head was actually sculpted in a software that I used prior to grad school, but started to use a lot more heavily after this piece, which was ZBrush. And then I 3D printed the head. And however, there wasn't a conceptual tie necessarily to why I was using digital sculpture in this piece specifically. And that started to really form another pathway for me in my art as to why I was using digital sculpture or the medium I was using. And in my next committee meeting, which was around this time, actually, it took place, I think, beginning of my second semester or end of my first, I was actually asked that question specifically of whether I wanted to use digital sculpture more as a transformative medium and tool or as a more process oriented. And so another way to say that is, do I want to use digital sculpture, but I could possibly use another medium to do the same artwork like clay, because I came from a figurative clay background, or am I trying to say something with digital sculpture that specifically is adhering to the medium itself that can only be said with digital sculpture? And my initial response actually was, again, coming from a very recent background in clay, was digital sculpture for me was just a tool. It was something that I could do in clay, but, digital sculpture was interesting because it, sped up the process. It was a lot less mess. I didn't have to use an armature, the editing, undoing. I mean, there's a lot of benefits as far as digital sculpture, as far as a transformative tool. But as I explored this question more in my work, I began to think about digital processes and languages that I could only share through digital sculpture. And that began to be like an interesting thought that I really wanted to explore in my work. So after my first semester, this was the next piece I worked on. It was a virtual reality experience titled No Exit. And this was really my first attempts at the integration of digital sculpture into virtual reality. And go ahead and share this here. And as a heads up for some of these videos, the audio doesn't come in amazingly well. So I'm gonna do my best to turn up my volume a lot higher for myself. So hopefully you guys can hear it clearly. I'll talk over it, but I wanted to have virtual reality portray, in this piece specifically, an even more mundane version of our reality. And instead of it being an escape, which normally VR is, it's something that is often used in gaming and something, you know, in its essence is trying to escape reality and enter a new one. And so drawing from my own experience of working 9-to-5 office jobs, which I had done for the 5 years in between my undergrad and graduate school, you know, I wanted to portray the mind space that I was in, of this never-ending loop of trying to escape this world and not feeling like I was able to. And so you can see the exit signs essentially just lead you in a circle around this cubicle office space. And don't want to watch anything related to Back to the Future. Let's go ahead and...
Need a professional website? I created one for...
All right. So my interest, though, I guess looking at virtual reality, there was still a very strong interest there, but also physical sculpture hadn't lost its appeal to me. You know, again, coming from a background of physical sculpture and specifically clay, it's something I was still interested in investigating. And I really wanted to see how I could use digital sculpture's mark within physical sculpture, and to be able to see processes that could speak to some of these ideas I was having surrounding perceptions of reality and making that metaphorical connection. And so in this piece, Mental Fragmentation, it was really the first piece that I started exploring digital sculpture's language and having process actually be a part of the piece, even in just a stagnant object. And I had been thinking about, at this point, the loss of memory. And, you know, my grandfathers, both of my grandfathers passed away to mind-related ailments. One was due to Alzheimer's, and one had a stroke that left him mentally handicapped for the last couple of years of his life. And so I was able to see pretty closely how the mind, you know, especially through time and through age, begins to decimate, begins to degenerate, and how sections of our reality can be completely lost. And so I was also around this time, as I was researching, came across a word, memory fragmentation, that initially I was relating to a human condition. I actually thought that it was relating to dementia in a way, but when I looked into it, it was actually a computer condition, which was very interesting. And what it is where in our hard drive, a computer hard drive, it's a phenomenon where there's leads to storage being wasted, and entire blocks of information can become corrupted and disappear. And mental fragmentation is actually the human condition, which relates to a very similar thing, but in our mind, of corruption within our memories and blocks of information disappearing. And I feel like this was the first piece where I started to make that connection between our mind and a computer processor. And I felt digital sculpture was starting to really ring true as far as a medium that was going to help me look at reality and its malleable nature, and to be able to speak on some of these ideas surrounding memory, degenerative processes within memory, our experiences through time and space, and being able to more clearly express that. And so I started to mine for more ideas of kind of this degenerative, malleable process within digital sculpture that I can show in my work. And what I came across, and you see it in this piece here, I'll actually go back to this first one, You know, on the left-hand side, it's very highly detailed, highly rendered and sculpted. But then on the right-hand side, as a contrast, it's really degenerated and decimated to its not necessarily lowest form, but probably the lowest form before it started losing complete detail of the form. And that was something that I began to do a lot more and to try to investigate within the software I was using. And I'm just going to show this as an example, you know, as far as this model here, just to show really how decimation works within the software of ZBrush, for those who are unfamiliar. And essentially what I'm doing is I'm using what's called a remeshing tool to give it a certain percentage that I want it to uphold as far as detail. And what it does is it continues to lower the resolution of the model while trying to maintain as much of that detail as possible before it entirely loses the integrity of the model. And you know, this meaning, the use of the meaning connected to decimation within my medium has been in most of my work from this point, because I felt like it again tied so well to this malleable nature of our perceptions and our reality. And I continue to use it as such. So in the process of decimation, something else that was significant in being able to understand it is the mesh, or the unseen wireframe of a model in the digital three-dimensional world. And the wireframe is completely unseen unless it's revealed. And this is something I can show here in this video. I turn on the wireframe so you can actually see, but it's essentially invisible. What makes up a model are polygons, which is the surface making up the actual mesh. And so this is the original model I showed before I decimated it. And as you can see, the wireframe determines the actual resolution of the model. So a higher, denser resolution in the wireframe, then more detail is being able to be shown. And so I thought about this relationship to our mind, and just like the seen polygons in contrast to the unseen wireframe, I realized there was this separation between what we perceive and what is actually there in reality. And I looked at the surface of the model as a way to address what was real. And then I felt the unseen wireframe, the base element of the digital realm, was like our perceptions. Our perceptions ultimately are forming what we see as real, yet they're constantly adjusting and changing and are malleable. And so as I continued using ZBrush and really researching digital processes, I found a way to actually manifest the wireframe and invert the model to make the wireframe the actual model. So I'll kind of show you how that's done here. So this is a decimated model that I just went ahead and used a certain tool called Z Remodeler to be able to invert the model to where the wireframe itself is the actual model, which again, normally is completely unseen on a model. And you know, wireframe for me, again, to reiterate, is the unseen and integral foundation to any dimensional object in the digital world. So like bones to our physical being, the digital realm can't exist without the wireframe. And in my work, it also symbolizes this unseen, the unseen perceptions, possibilities, and detriments that are variables to our existence. So not only does it represent our perceptions, but also the changing nature of those perceptions. And going into my last year, I finally felt, you know, like the process orientation in my work, along with my interest around perceptions, was, you know, starting to hold more, and I was starting to really see that pattern to setting into my work. And so going on into my last year, when I was looking at, you know, how I personally viewed reality and my own perceptions, I feel like that became the subject matter of a lot of my pieces, because I felt like it wasn't enough to just say, you know, digital sculpture can be a symbol for, you know, perceptions of realities this way. but also the subjects of my pieces needed to carry some story or something that connected to me individually and what my perceptions were. And so this might seem like a tangent, but it connects. I'll read this here. It says, myths are true expressions of our inner selves, revealed cryptically in image, symbol, and metaphor. They are something like dreams. Rationally, they may not ring true, but in a psychological sense, they express people's inner processes through the use of ingenious devices that conceal what must be concealed and reveal what must be revealed. So growing up religious in a fairly irreligious place, growing up in the Bay Area, moral directive was taught to me through stories, allegories, often from thousands of years ago, thus forming in large ways how I perceive the world and how I perceive things. And so mythology, for that reason, has a large presence in my art. It's often, I use it as a recontextualization of my own mind or mind space at the time. And I feel like that's the ultimate draw of myth, and why in even art history, how it's been reiterated time and time again, is because there's this relatability regardless of time, age, or circumstance that, again, as this quote hints to, is the psychological sense that's embedded within it. And that's something that really tied when I thought about mythos. Even the root of that word is a belief system that someone upholds. And so, thinking about perceptions is quite literally, just looking at our belief systems that affect our actions and how we perceive reality. And so looking at, how I integrated that into my work, I've always enjoyed, in particular, this story or myth of Icarus. And the myth itself was meant to caution individuals of failure that follows pride. But in my piece, I decided to look through the perception of Icarus, that perhaps his take on the story was trying to push past what's possible. I feel like in this piece, it kind of adhered conceptually a lot to the first piece I showed you in my first semester, Melting the Impenetrable Dimensions, because it was this idea of trying to push past the ceilings of reality and what we often believe, in these mythos that we form through our individual experience that often hinder us from what's possible. And I wanted to bridge also, in looking at the aesthetic, I kind of wanted to touch on that because that's something that you kind of see a certain pattern in my work. I wanted to, and I've always had this interest in bridging the classical with contemporary aesthetics, or new. And within this piece, I used the medium that Icarus, in the myth itself, had holding his wings together, which was wax. And I sculpted and I 3D printed two hands. One was like a physical hand, and then the other was the wireframe of it. And I actually made a mold of the hand, put the wireframe in it, and then poured hot wax in the mold. And then I used a heat gun to actually melt away the wax to be able to reveal the wireframe underneath. And you can actually kind of see it back here. If you're looking at my thing, there's the two hands. So the other aesthetic here that I feel like is tied, and you'll see in my body of work quite frequently, is the white and gold, is something that didn't start at this piece, but something I continued to use. And I feel the reason for this is also twofold in looking at the classical and the modern, or the contemporary. And it's really to invoke aesthetics from both of those. You can kind of see it in a classical form just from the way often most classical sculptures look, through Greek and Roman sculptures. Once the paint from thousands of years is worn off, it's, this white marble, right? But it was actually more for me in kind of a modernist approach of looking at the purity of my medium and trying to find all of the orientation I could to lead the mind towards this medium and why I was using it. I chose this very sterile, almost plastic white, because that's essentially what you're looking at when you are modeling in any software, digital modeling software, is this very sterile white object that you are sculpting or modeling. And so it was, for me, a way to kind of keep to this medium in a way, and to be able to call attention to the medium itself. The gold in my work is definitely more drawn to ideas that are found in classical work. You would see in early sculpture and paintings or illuminated manuscripts, oftentimes anything that was meant to mark value, divinity, and the spiritual, anything unseen, powers that were unseen that had an effect on reality, were marked in gold. And like our perceptions and, you know, guiding and determining our reality, I felt this connection in this unseen element. And again, anything that's unseen is like the wireframe that, again, I'm manifesting out of this digital realm. I've painted gold to adhere kind of to that historical context in my work, and to be able to connect that classical element. And again, it's this interest as far as bridging and finding connection between the new and the old. It's frequent in my work, and for those reasons. This piece here, looking back, was the next one that I did after Icarus. And I was still experimenting with this idea of the seen and the unseen. And in this case, I wanted to show really how one heavily influences the other. So the wireframe, again, is symbolizing this unseen fabric of our reality, which I interpret as, you know, the perceptions of it, and our thoughts, our biases, our memories that are making up those perceptions, while the outer shell is our accepted and our present reality. So drawn, you know, this sculpture specifically, I took it from the story of Lot's wife in the biblical account of Genesis, where they were commanded to leave Sodom and Gomorrah, and she looks back and turns into a pillar of salt. And this piece, in that sense, it relates to sentiment. It relates to the feeling or longing to reminisce on the past, and in doing so, also the damage that can take place from doing so. And the mind creates reality based on where it dwells the most. And in my experience, as I was kind of living in the past, you could say, especially as I mentioned, a lot of the hard, kind of burdensome upheavals in my reality at that time, coming into grad school, you know, I just noticed the more I kind of dwelled on the past, that's where my focus went. And it kind of felt, as in the sculpture, just this feeling of being dragged towards that focus. And so through again, the malleable element of the wireframe, I really tried to show this inner longing and mind space pull through the outer shell of reality, as if by looking back for long enough duration, the entirety would be transplanted to that focus. And should have kind of gone through these little angles here, I apologize. And again, all of these I'll get into as far as my exhibition and where you can find all of this. So the process within this sculpture also speaks heavily to this duality between the inner and the outer. So it's important to know that wireframe in my work, I'm not modeling it, if that makes sense, like I am as far as sculpting these models. It's very process induced from a duplicate of the modeled sculpture. So it's just the decimated form that I've then inverted. And so I always go back to this model just so I have reference videos for you guys and to be able to see how this works effectively. So by inverting a model into wireframe and then being able to have the more highly rendered portion, I'm able to play with that duality of this inner, the outer, the seen and the unseen. And I feel like it becomes more powerful in doing so. I'm able to work with both the sculpted piece and also the base element that constructs it. And it's derived from that same sculpture, but it's in its simplest form. And I, like in looking back, that was, you know, me actually pulling the wireframe through the model, the outer shell. So it wasn't me kind of modeling as it looks. It was quite literally using tools to pull and extrude the wireframe and the model itself. So one other digital process that I used in a piece I titled When Hope Meets Fate was extrusion. And again, that kind of also points to what I used in looking back. I used extruding, but what extrusion is simply pulling the polygons in a direction without increasing their resolution. So it kind of gives this very stretched feel. And in this sculpture, I symbolized it to use, or I used it to symbolize time and the passing of time specifically. And it goes along with, in tandem, our perception. And it becomes this reoccurring theme for me in my work is how time's effect on our perceptions of reality takes hold. And I was drawn specifically, again, tying to mythology and its presence in my work. I was thinking about the myth of Oedipus, which the simple version of the story is that he was told by the fates that one day he would kill his father and sleep with his mother. And by trying to avoid these outcomes, he actually inevitably brought them about. And I don't relate to those things specifically in the story, obviously, but just like Oedipus, I had seen myself as this hopeful young person, ignorant of a lot of things that inevitably I would learn through experience, and oftentimes hard experience, and that through age comes a lot of the changes of our perceptions. And the patterns of perceptions can be remarkably hard to change too. And so obviously, like, well, not obviously, but for me personally, fate wasn't something that I adhered to as a belief system, but just the idea of being a certain way and kind of oftentimes running this cyclical nature of ourselves and how hard it can be to change ourselves. This was a thought at the time when I was looking at this story, and sometimes what feels like the inevitable outcomes of our actions because of the mistakes or weaknesses we have as individuals. And the digital signatures in this also, I use the wireframe as the sensory element. So looking at the eye, that's a significant part of the story of Oedipus, where he, has an eye, obviously in the beginning of the story, or two eyes. And towards the end, after, being ashamed and having these awful experiences, he gouges out his eyes. And it's, again, this going from hope to, this tragedy towards the end of the story. And just this feeling of this kind of inescapable decisions that brought him to where he was. And so these last few pieces I've shown were 3D printed pieces, which method was important for me, just in being able to manifest the digital realm, into a physical space. And I feel in connection, 1 second. I'm afraid, okay. Good. I just wanted to make sure my sound was coming in clear. I had received a message, so I just wanted to make sure nothing was interrupted. So, sorry, getting back to the train of thought here. What was important for me in being able to manifest the digital realm in a physical space was using this tool called augmented reality. And I had investigated virtual reality, which again, virtual reality is being able to, as you saw in No Exit, build complete alternate environments that you can put a headset on and you can be taken to those environments. And augmented reality is quite different in the way that you're able to actually take digital assets or objects and be able to transplant them into our physical reality using devices. So a phone or a tablet, typically using the camera. And I felt the implications of that already tied so well to my interest in the seen and the unseen, and how perceptions affect our understanding of our physical reality. And so with some help and great brainstorming sessions with certain faculty, I created this augmented reality piece I titled Decimate. And also want to give credit to Ben Engel, who has helped me quite a bit throughout my education, but he's a programmer that I work with at the VR lab, and he helped with a lot of the coding for this piece specifically to be able to function the way it does, which I'll show you in this video here. And in this piece also, I was experimenting with a scanning process called photogrammetry. It's where you take two-dimensional photographs surrounding a 3D object, and you use software to construct a 3D model. And it also does a texture wrap using a mapping system called UV mapping, or UV wrapping, or UV mapping. And I was interested in stretching the limits of my medium between, again, this juxtaposition of highly intentional and detailed to process-induced and base and low resolution. And this really pushed the boundaries for that for me, because I was able to get photorealism in a way, well, quite literally, and being able to, again, use decimation from something that is this highly realistic became this interesting investigation into the medium also. And Decimate itself, this piece, go ahead and play it again here. It's symbolizing this constant routine, we're in, of analyzing our memories. And as I was researching, again, just how our memories work, the more and more we're actually looking at our memories, we begin to actually lose the trueness and integrity of what those memories originally were. So the truth of those begin to decimate quite literally. And so I wanted to draw attention to this fact in hopes that, we can be skeptical of what we feel we've experienced, and to know that with time comes, the decimation of our experiences, and what replaces much of the truth of that occurrence or that experience is bias in the way we saw it. And so the other function of it is to be able to rebuild our experiences, that over time, again, as you're stepping away from it, it begins to build up again. And so it's this cycle, again, that I'm trying to call attention to, of losing things through time, but also gaining when it comes to our reality and how we view it. The last piece I worked on, this was actually just this last semester, that I intended to be in my exhibition, was a sculpture I titled Faulty Sensory Perception. And it was a definition that I was looking at, that it often relates to the study of kinesthesia, which is the sensory versus perceived pain studies that often is done with physical therapy. But it's also related a lot to some of the definitions within cognitive psychology. And it's a condition where an individual doesn't receive accurate sensory feedback. And once it's processed, it creates a faulty perception of their condition or reality. And so they can see, feel, hear, taste, or smell one thing, but once that sensory feedback comes to the brain, it's something quite different. And so various causes to this have been observed as far as when I was researching it. A large one comes down to the abuse or through the decay of time and the aging of our senses. We start to lose that connection between the sensory feedback of, what it's experiencing to what our mind is telling us it's experiencing. And I also saw some irony there, just as I was looking at the subjective nature of reality. We all perceive things so differently and at various degrees, and by all individuals based on obviously a myriad of reasons. And so, knowing how we can trust one person's perceived sense to be less faulty than another's, I thought was also just this interesting question that I was trying to investigate with this piece and trying to look into. And in this piece, in the sculpture, I relate this condition really by sculpting the 5 senses individually. As you can see, they're individual, but adhering to each other also. There's this slight connection, almost borders between them. And the metaphoric connection to faulty is really shown also in just this aged and abused nature of each sense that I was trying to show. And so in some of my other work, but very much so in this piece, I started to create this duality between the highly intentional versus the process controlled. And the digital sculpted pieces are heavily and overly wrinkled and detailed. And I did this to symbolize just the outcomes of our perceptions that are flawed. And oftentimes we're looking at an untruthful and flawed memory or event, or again, sensory feedback that's coming back to us. And this is juxtaposed against just the base and the process produced wireframe. And in this piece specifically, I symbolized it as blood. And I was thinking of just again, the liquid form of reality, the malleable nature of reality, and the wireframe showing that. And also wireframe itself, being the life force of the digital realm, and physically for our human bodies, this life force that we are dependent on. And so yeah, there's this connection again that I'm making, but I started to notice in some of my work too that I was looking at some of this research intensive stuff I was doing into cognitive psychology and some of these senses, and some of my work started to still have these classical elements, but also started to be able to speak on just the nature of perception and how we view it more and more. So actually, I wanted to first, going into another piece in my thesis show, I wanted to elaborate more on it in connection to my exhibition. So I guess first, let me actually go into my exhibition itself. And normally I would actually, stop talking here and you would be able to go over and actually see my exhibition and go across the hallway and have wonderful snacks. But because of the circumstances, obviously we're meeting this way, and I had to adjust my exhibition accordingly. And so with COVID-19, the pandemic that has affected us all, this was a couple months into my last semester. And as the situation began to escalate, it became very clear that I was going to have to change my original plan. And for my exhibition, it would be completely altered. And I was very initially discouraged, as I'm sure the other grad students across the world and just in our program, as we've talked back and forth, it's a very discouraging thing. Well, I guess more Kylie, since she's graduating this year also. But I thought through solutions, and I found myself pretty lucky, as a matter of fact, just to be able to be working with the medium I was using, because everything I've made was originally in a digital form. And even if I 3D printed it, or it came out of something different, although a lot are obviously still in the virtual realm because they're a VR or in AR. And so I was able to create this virtual reality exhibition using all of these digital pieces. And I was able to make plans to create a virtual exhibition that would contain all the work, and all the work that I couldn't show physically, and a lot of it that was intentionally supposed to be physically seen. So I have this video here just of a walkthrough. This is actually me in the VR headset. And so you're able to kind of see from my point of view of what's going on. So using a controller, you're able to actually teleport throughout the gallery. And this is accessible for any VR headset that uses Steam VR. And so if you have a VR headset, have Steam VR, you can actually go to my website, danahansenart.com, and you can see all the still images, all the video walkthroughs, videos of this next piece that I'll show you guys, and you're able to actually download the experience and be able to go through the gallery itself. And so you can see here, when I use the teleporting, there's also these white halos that appear. And so when you actually teleport onto those white halos, it will bring up the photos of the actual pieces, and also a statement for each piece. So I'm just gonna go to some of those still images of those so you can kind of see the example. And again, I encourage you guys to go to my website, and you can definitely check all this out at your own pacing. I kind of have to fit this all in within 45 minutes, right? But this was just overall an amazing experience for me, just to be able to take my work that, again, had various intentions. And what was interesting is a lot of the work that started digital and that I intended physical went back into the digital. And so even for some of my future work, this was kind of an interesting experiment and to be able to think about what that entails, for the digital to be manifested physically and then to go back into the digital. And some of the ideas that were kind of swirling around that. So this is Decimate, the VR experience that AR experience that I showed earlier. So when you actually go to the Halo, this is just a still image, but you're able to see the video. It pops up in front of the QR code, so you can actually see the video of me experiencing the AR piece through my phone, which is what the video is. So the last piece I mentioned, it's located towards the back of the space where there's a couch and it's placed against the wall, and there's this VR headset. And so this was also funny that, there's a VR headset while you're in a VR headset, that you go into a different VR experience. So again, kind of just this interest and something that I want to pursue a little bit later on in my work. But this was titled Memoirs of Couch, and it's a interactive film experience, so to speak, where I guide the viewer through the visual metaphor surrounding the digital processes that speak to the fallibility of memory. So after the experience, you're actually transported back to the gallery as soon as it's finished. And what I'm going to do is I'll close my talk with a video of myself going through this VR experience, and then I'm going to open it up for questions after. And as far as questions, we were talking about earlier, you can actually raise your hand. It's a little control there that you guys have. And so I can see who's raising their hand, and then I can just unmute that person to ask the question. So if we can go about the questions that way, that would be great. And then as far as another heads up here, the audio quality, I've tested it a couple times, and it doesn't come in crystal clear when I'm sharing video from the tests I've done. So please, again, head to my website to see this, so that way you can really maybe get the full sense if it's not coming through crystal clear. I just wanted to say that. So let me. And I'll actually share the screen that I have my website on here, so that way you can actually see it. So danahansenart.com, MFA-thesis-exhibition. And if you come to MFA exhibition and just scroll down, you're able to download the experience right here, the video walkthrough that I just showed, and then the video of the VR experience here, and then the still images of this walkthrough, with also the statements for each of the pieces in the photo of the physical work. And then I actually included also all of the higher resolution photos that you can just go ahead and look at of the pieces. All right, so I'll go ahead and play this video, and I'll leave it for questions afterwards. And there's no audio for quite some time, so just as a heads up.
Space, the final frontier. These are the strange new ways. Seek out new life, new civilizations. These are its continuation to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life, new civilizations. These are the methods of the Starship Enterprise. continuing mission to seek out new life and new civilizations. These are the records of the structured enterprise. Its continuing mission to seek out new life and new civilizations.
What can't I remember?
There is no recalling the actuality of those events.
Even in the moment of the present happening, experiences being wrapped with narrative, bias, and individualized perception.
Look closer at a memory.
And lose the trueness and integrity of what it originally was.
What experiences lose their meaning and
and
existence as the subconscious takes hold. Here, this is what seems real.
Generated from converging neural pathways, computing our experience into
illusion that's
that is simply wrapped around the fragment of truth that
were there.
strip of the illusion. This is impossible. It's never seen for what it truly was, just what it was perceived as.
Everything was just what you think it was.
All right. I should have even shared beforehand that audio distortion was actually a part of the video in there. So you probably heard a lot of distortion because of that. So just wanted to clarify that. I should have said that before. But okay, I will open it up for questions here. I'm going to stop the screen share just so I can see everything a little bit more clearly.
Yeah. Tuesday, the 18th of August, 13th.
I hear someone. Is that?
Kelsey has a question.
Okay, let me, I guess I'm not seeing the hands. Is that,
I-
oh, I do see it. Okay.
So I've been unmuted by the host. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Cool. Thanks, Dana. Great to see all your work in such a sexy format. But I did have a question about actually a couple of things that we actually haven't talked about in our committee meetings. So sorry to curveball you, but
Sure.
upon watching these pieces one after the other, 2 years worth of work at one time, I noticed there's a specific tone that's recurrent in the work that's kind of dismal. It's kind of abysmal.
Right.
And I know we talked about that in terms of the rendering of the space that you've put your work in for the VR gallery.
Yeah.
It's kind of throughout the whole work. And I guess I wanted to ask you two questions, because one, you're making observations about the nature of reality, right? Which is like, it's in itself philosophical and abstract, but then you're doing that in such a way that seems to cast a sort of value judgment on that nature of reality. So I just want to hear you extrapolate. You're making these observations about the nature of reality. What is the tone of that observation, and what are the consequences of those observations? How does it show up in your life? How does it show up in culture?
Right. No, that's a super good question. Very big too. I think, I think, yeah, there is kind of this dismal look. I don't necessarily, I would say I'm an optimistic person, but there's this interest, I guess, that always adheres to the darker elements, or, you know, I think sometimes the human nature to focus on the darkness or some of the pits in our human experience. And so it's not necessarily to just call attention only to the fact that that is reality, even though, yes, I do see a large, push and look at kind of this darker side. Or but I think in some of the other work like Icarus, or like even Melting the Impenetrable Dimensions, and some of these ones where it is kind of this feeling of breakthrough that I also in some of my work was trying to call to. So looking at the future and the possibilities that are there, and trying to break through the ceilings of reality. And so yeah, I think that's something that's there. But of course, like I think what I mentioned too is thinking about my own perceptions as an artist. I think that was important to me. It wasn't just to come out of this as saying, perception is subjective, but also to look and analyze my own. And I think that's why there's a lot of personal tie to some of these pieces, and again, and even connecting myth and storytelling in some of these pieces, because it closely adheres to my own reality, and oftentimes some of the really hard things that I felt, I experienced either through grad school or prior, and just being able to relate that, by storytelling, or just again through my upbringing, which was so often through parable, and being able to connect stories to my own experience.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm nodding, but you can't see me. I'm nodding.
Cool. Oh, okay, Wendy, getting all my committee here. Let's see, wait. Am I able to unmute? I don't know if it's letting me. Okay, there we go.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I guess kind of a follow-up. I was thinking kind of the same thing in terms of, so what do we gain when we have this new awareness of the fallibility of memory, of perception? And it might be tied into, my other question was kind of, where do you see yourself going from here?
Right. Yeah, I think the gain of understanding that, again, like in Decimate, I kind of pointed out this idea of being more skeptical, I guess, towards our experience, and being able to look at the way we view reality more skeptically, because we can have an understanding of how fallible our memories, our experiences are, and even as we're living in the present, how so much of it is wrapped around our own biases. And I think that's very important to be able to understand individually, because I think it allows us to be better humans, more or less, of being able to step outside our own perception and be able to see and understand others more clearly. And I think what I also said, I remember when I was writing my thesis paper, was I don't think I'm necessarily trying to answer the question of what is, how do we change this reality, or how do we step out of our subconscious and try to take more control of our perceptions. I think oftentimes, and this kind of even goes back to Kelsey's point, I kind of lament the feeling of our perceptions, and kind of this, my understanding very recently of this cyclical nature of repeating the same mistakes, or trying to change my perceptions. And so it's again, I think oftentimes I'm more interested in posing those questions, as opposed to necessarily just coming up with those answers of how to do it. And as far as future work, you kind of mentioned that too, sorry. I see actually a lot of differences in my future work, I think. I'm thinking a lot more of in the physical work. I'm interested in exploring a lot of different things that have influenced me. Like I think some of the religious connotation in my work, I was thinking of bringing it into a more personalized tone, so it maybe relates more closely to me, and not necessarily just the broad idea of perceptions of reality, if that makes sense. Because I think that's something that was interesting, but I again am almost interested in just the relationship to me and as an artist, and you know why that's important to me. And so I think that's where my future work is going. And then just, you know, even some of the changes with my recent video piece, that was very interesting to be able to experiment with more of a like a film, or you know, something people can step into and experience and have a narrative to. I thought that was pretty fun to do, and I could actually see some of my future work kind of approaching some of that.
Great, thanks, great talk.
Thank you. So I'll just give it a maybe 30 seconds. I don't want to put time on it, but I'll just keep scrolling through the participants and see if there's any other hands raised. Oh, a physical hand raised from my mom. Here, let me go ahead and unmute. You guys are Hansen House, I think, right? Yes, I see it. Okay, you can go ahead.
Okay, Dana, I just wanted to know if that skeletal boy in the last film represented you kind of going through your childhood.
It did, yeah. So it was actually specifically, and Dad might remember this, it was the memory of, you know, when you would watch Star Trek: The Next Generation, and I would get on the couch arm, and actually when this USS Enterprise would blast off into space, I would jump off the couch. And so, yeah, it was this interesting memory, because as I was thinking about it, and this is something I actually worked close with Dan with, I was just thinking about how I couldn't really remember the setting of that memory. I couldn't remember how old I really was. I couldn't remember which house we were living in, because we moved a lot earlier on. And so like, it was just a very interesting memory to kind of tap into, as far as just how it's changing. And that's kind of why I brought up a lot of the cyclical idea in that video experience of, you know, you could see the different toys that I had were changing, the couch was changing. I just kind of wanted to invoke this idea of feeling like memory and its fallibility, you know, and especially as we're looking at memories from our childhood, and you know, how that's always going to be a constant in our lives when we understand our perception. So
very good. It was amazing to me that he had a street shark, or on the corner of that table, and I just have to apologize that I ever got rid of his street sharks, because it's amazing how these childhood memories, and I had found, you know, as my dad was getting dementia and went into Alzheimer's, the things that were most vivid to him were the memories he had as a child and not in his later years. And so it's just amazing the impression that we have. And I could see the games that Dana used to play with. I mean, it was kind of bringing back all these memories to me. Even the texture of that one sofa was in linen. And my daughter, Caitlin, has a sofa in her house that is just like that. So I could see little things that have come into Dana's mind that have made an impression. But it's just amazing to me how, as a child, those are almost your most vivid memories as you go through life. And it was very interesting, Dana. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
speaking of the street shark, this is
I had no idea he would love those so much. I gave them away. One other thing that I really loved, and I just have to say, we had an antique mall, and I remember when my mom was going to shut it down, and we were able to grab a few favorite things that we loved, and Dana grabbed these paperweights. He was fascinated with these paperweights because they had all kinds of formations in them. And he thought he was going to make a fortune off of those, and they got stored under his bed. But he has always had an artistic eye, and I wished I could have. At 3 years old, I remember him drawing the Addams Family and the detail in that picture. And I should have known that this art would be in him, but I didn't really take it serious till college. And I'm so impressed, and I love you so much, hon.
Love you too. All right, let's go ahead and I'll just pose any last questions here. One got turned on here. I think everyone got turned on. It's like all of them are unmuting. All right, so I guess I'll just leave it there. Thank you again for allowing me to kind of speak to you guys through this very unusual way and to share my artist talk. And again, if you want to see the exhibition in full, you know, outside of a VR experience, if you don't have a VR headset, you can go to my website and be able to see that. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Dana.
Really great job, Dana.
Thank you.
Can we unmute and make everyone video so we can applaud him? And congratulate him.
And I'm sorry,
I mean,
It's up to you for the video part.
yeah, and I apologize. I guess I was seeing in the chat, there was actually some people who, maybe if you guys want to reach out to me privately, I guess, and if you had some of these questions, I feel bad. There was a couple.
I did.
I muted everybody already. So.
All right, no worries. Thanks, guys.
Yay! We love you.
yay, way to go. Woo!
Appreciate it.
Round of applause.
A lot of hard work. Dana. Great
Congratulations.
job.
You didn't see it.
Thank you, guys. I'll go ahead and close out the meeting.
Thanks, Dana.
See you later.
Bye.